This video will demonstrate the proper use of the AFL Apex Advanced Fiber Retention System, AFRS, for ribbon and bare fiber applications. All parts of the AFRS are shown here, but only certain items will be used in each application in any Apex splice closure. The AFRS mesh system utilizes the V-clip installed on the splice tray. The V-clip is now paired with mesh inserts and mesh, which will connect the mesh to a mesh housing or other V-clip. These devices both mount on a mesh basket adapter, which will mount to 2 locations on the Apex basket. For low count applications, 2 V-clips can mount directly on the mesh basket adapter. Each V-clip can support up to 864 fibers of SWR or other rollable ribbon. For high count application, the mesh goes from the splice tray V-clip to a mesh housing. This housing accepts up to 6 inserts, which can be installed on either or both sides of the basket. Confirm the V-clip cover is secured to the base. There is a texture marking on the V-clip cover to show the orientation for the mesh insert. Bring the clip at a 45-degree angle with a large tab at the bottom to the splice tray entrance, aligning the 2 reference tabs of the clip with complete holes in the splice tray. Rotate clip up until it snaps in place to secure it. These clips may be installed in up to 4 locations of Apex splice trays. The same method will be used to secure the V-clip to the mesh basket adapter in one of 2 locations. Install the empty mesh basket adapter onto the Apex basket by aligning with 2 strength ribs on the bottom of the basket. Snap into place and ensure it is locked in place and will not slide side to side. 1 mesh housing or 2 V-clips may be installed in each mesh basket adapter. For basket to tray protection, cut the bulk mesh at least 12 1/2 inches, leaving 1/2 inch beyond each clip end as shown. Installing fiber into the mesh is a 3-step process. Install the first mesh insert onto the fiber. The taper will always be facing towards the mesh. Placing a small piece of tape around the tip of the fiber group may help in this process. The second step is to insert the fiber through the pre-cut mesh. Flex the mesh end and slide the mesh tube a few inches over the retention insert with the narrow tapered end towards the mesh. Back to the end of the fiber for the third step. Place the second retention insert over the fiber in the opposite direction, once again with a tapered end towards the mesh. Make sure the clip and cover of the clip are intact and that there is no debris. Pinch the mesh of the fiber and lay the mesh into the open clip about 2 inches behind the cut and slowly pull insert into the clip. Set into the V-clip and close the cover. Gently pull the mesh to engage the insert. Make sure unfrayed mesh is on the insert for proper retention. Secure it with at least 1/2 inch of mesh still exposed. You will install the mesh inserts into both V-clips the same way, starting with the splice tray V-clip, and work any twisting out before securing the basket clips. An alternative use of the mesh basket adapter is holding the mesh housing. There are two applications this housing can be used for. On the left, the mesh housing is tapered away from the basket. You will be installing fiber in the mesh from the basket to the splice tray only. On the right, with the mesh housing tapered towards the basket, you will be installing fiber in the mesh from cable entry, around the basket, and then up to the splice tray. When installing for the mesh from basket to tray, you will utilize 12 1/2 inches of mesh length and install the mesh housing with the taper towards the mesh. This is installed taper away from the basket, allowing the mesh to go from basket to tray. In either orientation, you will fill the mesh housing from the base to the top, alternating sides each layer. To install mesh into the mesh housing, make sure unfrayed mesh is on the insert for proper retention. Take the mesh insert pinched in place and set the fiber-filled mesh into the proper slot about 2 inches behind mesh insert. Gently pull the mesh to engage the insert, then firmly pull it to secure in place with at least 1/2 inch exposed mesh. When using the mesh housing in the orientation shown with the taper towards the basket, you will use a much longer piece of mesh. The fiber will go directly from the cable attachment unit to the mesh at the basket entrance. Once the pre-cut mesh is on the fiber, the end closest to the sheath will be installed in the mesh housing, starting from the bottom and work up. To install mesh into mesh housing, make sure unfrayed mesh is on the insert for proper retention. Take the mesh with the insert pinched in place and set the fiber-filled mesh into the proper slot, about 2 inches behind the mesh insert. Gently pull the mesh to engage the insert, and then firmly pull to secure it with 1/2 inch exposed mesh. Slide the fiber-filled mesh into the housing. Route the mesh tubes around the basket under the yoke. Bring across to the splice tray V-clip. With this installation, it is best to attach the mesh housing and work twists towards the splice tray, finally securing at the splice tray V-clip. When the AFRS system is utilized with tubed ribbon fiber, the mesh basket adapter and the mesh housing are not needed. You will only need mesh V-clips and mesh retention inserts. Slide the mesh over the tube prior to cutting the tube off of the fiber. The tube length and mesh length should be in the instructions for the proper length for the apex closure utilized. Slide mesh over uncut tube, cut tube to proper length. Clean fiber and slide mesh tube back over the fiber. Route the fiber around the basket in the mesh under the spline and attach mesh to V-clip on splice tray. Work mesh slack back and over the tube. Secure the tube to the basket retaining mesh. Finally, tape the mesh to the tube, completing the installation.